Thank you, Marissa. The theme of this live stream is working class women lead the way. The fight back has begun. And I want to say a word or two about that title. It is the view of the Party for Socialism and Liberation that we are entering, or really have entered, a period of intensifying class struggle. Our tactics, our agitation, our slogans, our organizing approach, all of it is premised on this assumption. The class struggle always goes on. As Marx and Engels wrote in the manifesto, history is really nothing more than the class struggle, at least since society was divided into haves and have-nots. But for the most part, the class struggle is always a one-sided affair. The haves, the elites, the rich, the powerful are carrying out an endless war against the working class. What we are presuming, a new period of intensified class struggle. What we mean is that we are anticipating that this will become a two-sided class war. The vast portion of the working class that has become pauperized, left jobless, facing eviction, facing hunger, as we've heard today and as we've seen in the news so recently, but the number of children going hungry right now in the United States and across the world and how that's expanding. Every day, these conditions will compel us to fight back. The car caravans taking place this Saturday, May 30th, are just one example of what is sure to come. And we believe that in this new era of class struggle, working class women in particular, women who have always been in the struggle, will more and more assume their rightful place in the very center of the leadership of this struggle as it intensifies, as it becomes a two-sided struggle. It was always the struggle of oppressed people. And of course, women have also always suffered a multitude of oppressions. Those are the people who become the leadership in times of new class struggle and in moments of widespread radicalization. This would mark a radical, real turning point. But it's not so long ago that women were treated by law as nothing more than the property of their husbands or fathers. Coverture laws dominated in the United States until the late 1800s. And coverture meant that married women were not legally independent. They were not legally people, really. Women could not own any property, not even the clothes they were wearing. They couldn't sign contracts, start businesses, control their own bodies, make decisions for their children, even access an education without their husband's permission. They couldn't keep their wages. Any money they made did not belong to them. And the very structure of US society is steeped in these old, backward regulations that were designed specifically to enforce the legal, political, and physical subjugation of women. It was in 1979 that Louisiana became the last of the United States to have its, quote, head and master law struck down. Until the 1960s, women weren't even allowed to serve on juries regularly. Marital rape wasn't declared illegal in all 50 states until 1993. And that process of declaring it a crime started in the very late 1970s. So it was the militant women's movement of the 1960s and the 1970s that undid so many of the things that we consider now to be ancient history. That absolute inequality of women, though, dominated the consciousness and thinking of society until really very recently. If you think about it, until that movement shifted the consciousness and changed the material reality of women, we were kept out of sciences, out of math, out of every occupation. Our participation in sports was limited to non-existent. Women weren't able to apply for credit cards. Divorce laws were weighted in the interests of men. Physical violence and abuse went completely unchallenged. And this year, on August 26th, we will be celebrating the day 100 years ago when women nationally won the right to vote. This past week actually marked the founding of the U.S. Constitutional Convention. The Constitution is held up as some perfect document that enshrined democracy, but really it was egregiously reactionary and upheld slavery. 39 men came together in that Constitutional Convention, rich, white men, all property owners, and half of them slave owners. And they came together and formed what is now called the, quote, perfect union. Yet it took another 137 years for women to get the right to vote on paper. And that right to vote, the 19th Amendment, was a hard-fought victory that very, very few of us learn the reality about. It was influenced by global events. The 1917 Russian Revolution made huge changes for women materially, and they did it immediately. The first days of the revolution, divorce, abortion, the right to a vote were secured, and this sent a shockwave around the world. If a poor, backward country under the thumb of a feudal monarchy could in a few days give these rights, and especially the right to vote, which women had been fighting and advocating for since the early 1800s, what did that mean for the developed countries that had afforded women so little? When that Russian Revolution sparked some of those thinking and made that shockwave across the world, the domestic movement for women's rights had already been fighting for decades. On March 3rd of 1913, 8,000 women marched the day before Woodrow Wilson was inaugurated in a parade to demand the constitutional amendment for a right to vote. Thousands of people were in the city for the inauguration, mostly men. They ridiculed, they jostled, and they attacked the 8,000 marchers. And by the end of the day, 100 women were in the hospital. In 1917, the suffragists, in yet another tactic, decided to picket the White House every single day. But later that year, the U.S. entered World War I, and the pressure was great for them to stop. And at that time, they were known as the Silent Sentinels, and they refused to stop. They were attacked by mobs and the police. They were repeatedly arrested and imprisoned. In the prison, they went on hunger strike. They were force-fed. The guards forced tubes down their throats to feed them. Later that year, on November 14th, 33 women taken yet again. Some had already been in prison and come back out onto the picket. They were taken to Occoquan Workhouse in Virginia, a prison that is now an art center, actually. And they were demanded that day, as they were being booked, to be treated as political prisoners. And instead, they were brutally beaten and tortured. One had a heart attack because of the torture and never received medical attention. Dorothy Day, who became a founder of the Catholic Charities movement, was slammed on an iron bench. And those were just a few among the many women who were beaten that day. The opposition to the suffrage was organized by the liquor and brewing industries, factory owners, railroads, banks, big city political machines. They were afraid women would vote for progressive reforms. Southern racists objected to having more Black voters. They made arguments about states' rights and family unity. They said wives were already represented at the ballot box by their husbands, but yet state after state ratified the amendment. And millions of women turned out on November 2nd, 1920 to vote. Regardless, there were still many obstacles in the way. States had restrictions that limited women from voting. Black women in particular were targeted and disenfranchised as women of all nationalities attempted to vote. That is because women have always been the dominant part of the working class. We have worked in the jobs and the fields. We've maintained through unpaid labor the family. The unpaid labor of the family, we clean, we do the dishes, we do all the things that Cassie's talking about, even when we work outside the home. But despite shouldering that burden, our basic fundamental rights are repeatedly denied. The right to be heard, the right to property, the right to vote. And the treatment of women as property, the oppression of women, has historical roots in the development of society. For most of history, we have organized ourselves. Human society has been organized communally. There were no haves and have-nots. Survival and abundance were not secure. There was no surplus of resources. And this becomes entirely upended as humans develop technology that allows for surplus, allows for some to have and some to have not. And the first cleavage, the first separation between haves and have-nots is between men and women. Men owned the private property, and women's sexuality and sex had to be controlled so that wealth and inheritance could be controlled. And that, hundreds of years ago, predates our current reality, but it dominates our current society, the society of capitalism, where the ruling class of owners of the big banks and corporations exploit the majority class of workers. And the initiation of this general organization of society starts with the institution of the oppression of women. Women because of this oppression, because of the burdens we bear, are also the key to the liberation of our class. When women rise up and challenge oppression, because we have shouldered so much for so long, we become natural leaders. The 21st century will be the century of women. We can see it globally and we can see it domestically. We can see it in what's already been said this evening. We've seen it in the rise of the labor movement, not just the teachers, the nurses, the hotel workers. It is not only women, but it is predominantly women who are leading this drive. We represent the untapped strength of our class. And more, our emancipation will lead to an emergence of a dominant leadership force in our class. This energy, this leadership is present in our history and is also the cornerstone of our future. Who led the Underground Railroad? Harriet Tubman. Who fought for abolition and for the right to vote, passionately and eloquently? Sojourner Truth. Who led the struggle for Puerto Rican independence? Lolita Lebron. The names go on and on. We are rarely taught these names of our predecessors who fought before us, but their names could fill pages and pages. The development of class society has relegated us to non-person status, has attempted to control our bodies and deny ourselves. But we, the women of the working class, have always resisted exploitation and oppression. And today, in the midst of a pandemic that has laid bare the rampant inequalities and daily brutalities of this system, we must struggle, we must organize, and we must build, like we are starting to do. The way the movement is developing now, the way they are not getting away with trying to constantly brutalize people across this country and relegate us to positions of hunger and poverty and joblessness. We will organize, we will build, and we will relegate oppression and exploitation to the dustbin of history. Thank you.